During the 20th century, the aircraft carrier emerged as the military's most powerful, mobile, and flexible weapon, capable of projecting its air group over vast expanses of water, launching surprise attacks on enemy fleets and land bases, then swiftly disappearing. It has become axiomatic that in times of crisis, the first question asked by a president of the United States is, "Where are the carriers?" But it hasn't always been so. The idea of taking aircraft to sea began as little more than an experiment before the Navy had either planes or pilots. On December 17, 1903, Orville Wright launched a century of aviation firsts when the aircraft he designed with his brother Wilbur took flight over the wind-swept dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. By the end of the decade, variations on the Wright brothers' design had proliferated, and the French had even adapted an aircraft that could land and take off from the water. But the question was soon raised, might an airplane be flown to and from the deck of a ship? In 1910, at Hampton Roads, Virginia, the idea was put to the test. In mid-November, a young Curtiss Aviation exhibition pilot named Eugene Ely revved his engine and rumbled down an inclined platform specially built over the forecastle of the cruiser USS Birmingham. Ely reached the end of the ramp and his plane dropped suddenly, but he fought the controls and somehow stayed airborne, though part of his plane did touch the water. 2 months later in San Francisco Bay, Ely proved that aircraft could also land on ships. Ely took off from a land base and headed across the bay toward the USS Pennsylvania. Twice he had to break off his landing attempt, but on the third try, Ely headed straight for the ship, cut his engine when he was 75 feet from the fantail, and allowed the wind to glide the aircraft onto the landing deck.
The plane that Ely was using didn't have any brakes, so to keep him from crashing into the mast, they devised a system of sandbags and ropes designed to slow him down as he landed on the deck. And this really was the first primitive arrestor gear system.
57 minutes after his historic feat, Ely turned around, trundled down the Pennsylvania's deck, and made a perfect takeoff. Though some viewed Ely's demonstration as a mere stunt, a few visionaries saw tremendous potential in the marriage of naval power and aviation, potential that was first exploited during the First World War. Prior to completion in 1917, the British converted the light cruiser HMS Furious to the world's first aircraft carrier by adding a short launching platform forward. After several months' experience, she received a landing deck and hangar aft, but still retained the funnel and superstructure amidships. Though this arrangement left much to be desired, aircraft launched from Furious executed successful raids against German Zeppelin bases along the North Sea. It wasn't long before other navies began exploring the possibilities of seaborne aviation. In 1920, the U.S. Navy ordered the conversion of an electric-powered collier, the USS Jupiter, for the express purpose of conducting experiments with naval aviation. Recommissioned in March 1922 as USS Langley, she became the U.S. Navy's first aircraft carrier. While the Langley was being rebuilt, a startling series of experiments took place that changed forever the dynamic between air and sea power. General Billy Mitchell, one of the most vocal and controversial early air power advocates, infuriated the Navy by claiming that aircraft could sink warships and boasted he could prove it. In June of 1921, Mitchell got his chance and made the most of it. During a series of controlled attacks, Mitchell's bombers successfully sank numerous ships, including the captured German battleship Ostfriesland and later the U.S. battleship Alabama.
The Mitchell bomb tests, which took place in 1921, proved to the flyers that ships were indeed vulnerable to air attack. Well, the Navy disputed this and said that the tests were invalid because the warships sunk had not been moving and had not been defending themselves. So throughout the 20s and the 30s, this debate raged over what role air power could play in future naval engagements.
While theorists argued over what the Mitchell bomb tests meant, many officers in the U.S. Navy realized that air power could have a dramatic impact on naval operations. Just exactly how that impact would be made became the question of the day. a question that USS Langley helped solve. As the first U.S. Navy carrier, Langley played a significant role in the development of naval aviation doctrine and was the scene of numerous historic events. Through tests with her and her air groups, the U.S. Navy learned how to operate planes on ships, the fundamentals of which are still in practice today. It was on Langley that the idea of tying aircraft down on deck rather than striking them below immediately after landing was perfected. The result was greater flexibility in flying operations. A safe arrestor design was also developed, abandoning the fore and aft arrangement preferred by the British in favor of parallel cross wires. The new system allowed aircraft to remain on the forward deck protected by a crash barrier while other aircraft continued to land. The development and operation of catapult systems, firefighting procedures, fuel handling, and operational features of the hangar and flight deck that began with Langley were integrated and improved upon with the introduction of two Lexington-class carriers, the Lexington and the USS Saratoga. Laid down and partly built as cruisers before being converted to carriers to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, the ship set the pattern for future American carrier design, with a long topside flight deck, a starboard side island combining command and control spaces, and a large, deep hangar deck. It was with Lexington and Saratoga, the biggest carriers in the world, that the U.S. Navy learned the rudiments of carrier task force operations and refined the organization of the Air Department. What emerged was the concept of a balanced air group capable of scouting and striking the enemy while protecting the fleet at the same time. And it was here where the carrier's great versatility and flexibility was discovered. Through the early 1920s, the Navy saw aircraft as primarily an instrument of fleet reconnaissance. In the attack role, they were seen as a way to strike at light warships such as torpedo boats and destroyers, while the battle line engaged the enemy's capital ships. For offensive operations, the concept of the air group evolved, built around a fighter squadron, a dive bombing squadron, and a torpedo squadron. Dive bombing, a concept developed by Marine aviation during the interwar years, showed great potential as a tactic for destroying enemy warships. Techniques were refined to the point that simulated attacks during fleet maneuvers were judged by observers to be deadly effective.
The air groups, starting in the 1930s, were really based around the dive bombing squadrons as being the mailed fist of naval aviation. And as a result, you see that not only do the dive bomber squadrons practice this tactic, but the scout squadrons and the fighters are all trained to do dive bombing. Because of this, the torpedo squadrons are de-emphasized and their numbers are shrunk to 15 aircraft per air group, whereas with the dive bombers, you had 36.
As operational doctrine evolved and improved, the Navy increasingly came to think of carrier air power as a weapon unto itself. During the 1929 fleet maneuvers off Panama, advocates demonstrated just how effective and flexible a weapon naval aviation could be.
The USS Saratoga was detached from the main battle line and operated independently and struck with its air group the Panama Canal, and the refs declared the Panama Canal destroyed. Well, this was a lesson that was not lost upon the U.S. Navy, and in fact, they incorporated through the 1930s the idea of independent carrier task forces working away from the main battle line into the main U.S. Navy battle doctrine, and that was the doctrine that was carried into battle once the Pacific War began in 1941.
Through the 1930s, the Navy ordered a succession of increasingly capable aircraft until by the end of the decade, fleet carriers contained enough fighting power within the air groups to represent a major threat to any surface force. Along with ongoing improvements to the air wing, the carrier fleet itself had evolved and grown. USS Ranger, commissioned in 1934, was the first ship of the United States Navy designed and built from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. Ranger was shorter and much lighter than Lexington-class carriers, but was capable of carrying nearly as many aircraft since her hangar and flight deck extended beyond the main hull. Though this unique innovation was implemented in succeeding U.S. carrier designs, the attempt to carry the largest air group possible came at the expense of speed. Ranger's twin screws were incapable of propelling her beyond 29 knots. Building on the experience gained from Ranger, the Yorktown class represented a fundamental change in carrier design. Though smaller than Lexington and Saratoga, Yorktown and her sister ship Enterprise could carry the same number of aircraft and 30% more aviation fuel. Sporting a single large island that housed the air and ship control facilities, gunnery fire control, and the smokestack, the new vessels were exceptionally seaworthy and more maneuverable than their predecessors. Due to treaty restrictions on displacement, they were built without adequate underwater protection, deck armor, or guns, yet with hundreds of watertight internal compartments, they were also capable of surviving heavy battle damage. A third Yorktown-class carrier, the USS Hornet, joined the fleet in 1941, with minor improvements over her two sister ships, including a significant increase in anti-aircraft weapons. The final pre-war addition to the U.S. carrier fleet was USS Wasp, another byproduct of the Washington Naval Treaty. With only 15,000 tons available to flesh out its carrier fleet, Wasp was similar in size and performance to Ranger, but more closely resembled Yorktown-class ships. She was the first carrier fitted with an outboard elevator, which consisted of a platform for the front wheels and an outrigger for the tail wheel. By supplementing the centerline elevators, this innovation greatly reduced flight deck congestion and improved air operations. However, design compromises due to weight restrictions meant that Wasp was underpowered and had very little armor plating, especially at the waterline. As carriers and aircraft grew in size and capabilities, the Navy's air attack doctrine evolved into an airborne version of combined arms theory. When attacking an enemy task force, each American carrier would launch its air group, torpedo bombers first, followed by the scout and dive bomber squadrons, and finally the fighters. Forming up, the air group would proceed to the enemy task force and launch their attack in concert with each other. The scout bombers would strike first, using light bombs to suppress the task force's anti-aircraft defenses. Then the torpedo bombers would make their approach, splitting into two groups, which would make an anvil attack on the selected ship's bow. Simultaneously, the dive bombers would roll over and execute their runs using 1,000-pounders designed specifically to penetrate armor plating. This combined attack became the basis for all the Navy's offensive air operations at the outset of World War II, and as the first 6 months of the Pacific War showed, the basic doctrine could be very effective. But where the tactics worked, time and again, combat against the Japanese demonstrated major weaknesses in some of the Navy's frontline aircraft. These early battles revealed that while U.S. naval aviation had made great strides, it still had a long way to go before its full potential could be unleashed. In the meantime, the pilots and crews paid a heavy price for the inadequacies of their own aircraft. A full year before the United States entered World War II, naval air squadrons possessed the three main carrier-based combat aircraft they would take into battle against the Japanese. For fleet air defense, most air groups had recently converted to the Grumman F4F-3 Wildcat. Grumman had long been a provider of rugged seafaring aircraft, and the F4F inherited many of the features of its ancestors. Originally designed as a biplane and intended to replace the F3F, by the time the Wildcat was ready to come off the drawing board, it was clear that the biplane era was a thing of the past. Grumman's engineers went to work and reconfigured the Wildcat to be the company's first all-metal monoplane. Stubby and barrel-shaped, the Wildcat provided a significant upgrade to the Navy's fleet air defenses in 1940 when it first started reaching operational units.
The F4F was a very sturdy, dependable plane and a joy to fly. The cockpit arrangement was extremely convenient for the pilot. Not every plane that I flew was like that.
At the time, I thought it was a real red-hot airplane. Of course, not having flown many red-hot airplanes, I didn't know any better anyway.
The F-4F saved my life because of the armor plate and so forth. Wouldn't have wanted to be in the Buffalo during the World War II.
Prior to the arrival of the F-4F, the Brewster F-2A Buffalo was the only modern monoplane fighter the Navy possessed, but its operational limitations restricted its effectiveness.
It was a stubby little aircraft, and just flying instruments, keeping the ball and needle in the middle is part of a good gunnery run. It was a terrible gunnery platform, and unfortunately for the Marines, the Navy wound up whatever was left in the Navy, they gave them to the Marine Corps. Plus, the engines would freeze up at very inopportune times, like on takeoff, and about the time you were ready to lift off, the old prop would be standing still out there in front of you.
You say, what do you remember about an airplane that you flew? What was the most significant thing? Of that Brewster Buffalo, the emergency landing gear extension was very simple. We can't do things that way today. There was a cable that ran across the cockpit right under the instrument panel. Over on the right rail of the cockpit was a clip that had a pair of wire cutters in it. And if you had to drop your landing gear through the emergency system, you took the wire cutters out and you cut the wire, and the gear dropped of its own weight. You skidded into the lock position.
In the mock-up, that cable was real red and nice, clean, and you could tell which one it was. When you got in the airplane, there was no way I'd have ever cut one of those wires because you couldn't tell which one it was. It could have been the rudder, it could have been the ailerons, it could have been anything. But I wasn't about to cut one, but I didn't have to anyway, so.
The Wildcat, with its rugged construction and durable landing gear, took care of almost all the problems encountered with the Buffalo. Still, the placement of the F-4F's main gear did cause problems for the pilots.
And a Wildcat was a hard airplane to land because it had a very narrow tread. It was only 5 feet between the wheels. And they had a very soft oleos supporting and the airplane used to rock when you taxied it.
Some people, especially if they had rather short legs, had difficulty landing it, especially in a crosswind, as it had a tendency to ground loop. The gear being so narrow that it was just a little harder to handle on the ground than most airplanes.
One holdover from earlier designs was the F-4F's manual landing gear retraction system. The pilot had to crank a small handle in the cockpit to get the gear up into the fuselage.
Made for some very interesting takeoffs, particularly at night when you take off and you see the planes going up and down as you're cranking it up and down.
If you let go of the handle, that sucker would start spinning the other way and really wrap you across the wrist, and you learn not to let go of that handle. But it was a good little airplane.
It didn't have great maneuvering capabilities, didn't have great rate of climb, go downhill like heck. I've seen 420, 430 knots on it. We're going straight down, but it was an airplane that at the time it really did the job.
Slightly faster, more maneuverable than the F-2A, and armed with a quartet of 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, the F-4F-3 represented the most advanced Allied carrier-based fighter in existence at the time. That didn't mean much, however, given that the state-of-the-art in the Royal Navy in 1940 was the slug-slow Blackburn Rock and the awkward Fairey Skua. Both aircraft were miserable failures in Fleet Air Arms Service, and when the British learned of the Wildcat, they ordered them for their own shipboard fighter squadrons. In truth, the Wildcat lacked the performance of most of the frontline fighters then in service in Europe. Against a Luftwaffe Messerschmitt 109, the Wildcat stood little chance. It simply did not have the speed or rate of climb necessary to tangle with the world's best, even when it first reached the fleet. However, the Navy did not seem overly concerned by the Wildcat's deficiencies, especially since its most likely adversary would be the Japanese. Refusing to heed the warnings from Chinese pilots and American observers in the Far East, the Navy continued to delude itself that the Japanese did not have any modern aircraft.
The Navy Scout 95 looks like a typical Japanese land biplane. It has a blunt nose, 2 wings, 2 cockpits, and a tall rounded tail that leans backward.
But in September 1941, a tactical bulletin was published that detailed the performance of a new Japanese fighter called the Type O, or Zero.
We finally got into where we were getting intelligence on the Japanese fighter, what we will be coming up, the Zero again, what we will be facing when we actually go out into combat. The Japanese Zero was a very lightweight, very agile aircraft with a good power loading. It had agility, it had good performance.
Though many discounted the report, Jimmy Thatch, the commander of VF-3, reasoned that if it was accurate, the Japanese had a fighter that could fly faster and farther than the Wildcat. Worse, it could outclimb and outturn the F-4F as well.
After Thatch read this report, he sat down in his kitchen in San Diego and started playing around with matchsticks on his kitchen table, trying to figure out a set of tactics that he and his fighter pilots could employ that would minimize the advantages that the Zero possessed over their own aircraft. And what he came up with was later known as the Thatch weave.
Thatch discarded the traditional leader and wingman, flying a stepped-back echelon formation, and instead positioned his wingman 90 degrees off his wingtip at either 3 or 9 o'clock. When attacked, the engaged fighter would set up the kill by inducing the enemy to maneuver predictably, thereby making it easier for the free fighter to position for a shot.
Instead of having a leader and a shooter, you have 2 potential shooters. And Joe Foss, the top Marine Corps ace of the war and the highest scoring Wildcat pilot, said that to him the great advantage of the Thatch weave is that it let you keep eyes and guns pointed in almost any direction all the time.
As Navy and Marine pilots put Thatch's ideas to the test, their air discipline and skill developed to the point that they could offset the Zero's superior performance with better teamwork. It meant that a slower, less agile aircraft could not only survive in that kind of combat arena, but it could win as well. The Thatch weave provided for fighter pilots the tactical doctrine that dive bombing squadrons had long possessed. What they lacked was a plane to replace their fussy SBC Helldivers and Vought Vindicators.
Up until the time of the SB-2U Vindicator, and all the Navy's dive bombers and scout bombers had been biplanes. So you had the maze of struts and wires between the 2 wings. This was the first monoplane scout bomber. And it did definitely increase performance when it was introduced to the fleet in 1937, because the speed with which it could travel was 45 miles per hour faster than the aircraft it replaced in the scout bombing, dive bombing role.
We cruised normally with a 500-pound bomb load at 8,000 feet. You cruised at 105 indicated, and everybody else was doing 155 indicated. The Zeros, of course, 355 indicated. The dive bombing was made in our standard 70-degree dive with your wheels down because we didn't have dive flaps. Your plane became a flying rock because your ailerons became very stiff, your rudder very stiff, and your elevator control stiff, because as you increase in speed, the pressure builds up, and the only way you could really move them around was by use of your tabs. And so if you were diving on a moving target, it was quite a proposition to get on the target and stay on it.
The Vindicator's shortcomings were more than made up for with the introduction of the Douglas SBD Dauntless, which first entered service in late 1940. By 1941, the SBD-3 incorporated larger self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection, a bulletproof windshield, and 4 machine guns. Without a doubt, the SBD was the most successful American dive bomber during World War II.
The SBD was a real easy airplane to fly. It flew as easy as anything I've ever flown. And you could go straight down in an SBD from whatever height you wanted.
Douglas made quite an airplane when they did the SBD. Great airplane.
Well built, easy to fly, and exceptionally stable, the SBD was designed to handle the incredible stresses of a dive bombing run.
We'd get up to no higher than 8,000 feet. At no point getting any higher. Everything in a dive from 15,000, 20,000 feet down is just wasted time and energy getting there.
And they all just peel off and go into a column and follow the leader.
You came around the target in a circle so that the gunners on the ground couldn't shoot at the same angle for every plane all the planes coming down.
And when you're going down in column, those pilots are strafing those 50 calibers, and you're looking up at the guy behind you, and those tracers are going by your wing, and you just want to blast him to get him out of there. It just scares the hell out of you.
One secret to the SBD's effectiveness was its innovative dive flaps.
These flaps were about 5.5 feet long and 17 or 18 inches wide and perforated. Now you wonder why they're perforated. They were perforated so that the air could flow through back over your tail surfaces and give you control. You went into your dive, and your dive hardly ever went above 245 or 50 knots, and you became very maneuverable. So you flew the plane in a dive just as if you were flying it straight and level. And when you got down to about 1,500 feet, you reached over and got your hand on the bomb release and gave it a good jerk at about what you figured was 1,000 feet, and then pulled on out.
When you were straight and up and down and you're 1,000 feet and you pickle off, and no place the bomb's going to go but exactly where you're pointing. Very lethal.
For its day, the SBD could carry a heavier bomb load than most other dive bombers. In fact, it could carry more bombs than the Japanese Ki-48 twin-engine bomber.
Well, they carry a 1,000-pounder or on the belly rack, or they could carry a 500-pounder and a 250 wing bombs.
While the SBD was an excellent offensive weapon, its lack of speed made it vulnerable to enemy fighters when not properly escorted.
But of course, the SBD was, as it was known to be slow but deadly, was really slow.
Our protection was the numbers in close formation, flying low over the water.
The Dauntless's lack of speed made it an extremely vulnerable aircraft, especially when faced against opposition like the Zero. The Air Force learned this lesson the hard way in New Guinea in 1942 when they sent a squadron of A-24s, which was their version of the Dauntless, into action, and they were chopped to pieces over Leh. And as a result of that, the Army Air Force actually de-emphasized dive bombing, and only a few A-24 squadrons ever got into combat. So the Dauntless, for all its advantages, had some significant weaknesses.
The Douglas TBD Devastator rounded out the Navy's carrier air groups in 1941. Designed and built in the mid-1930s, the TBD was a graceless, if functional, torpedo bomber that had entered service in 1936 as the Navy's first all-metal monoplane. While the TBD bridged the gap between the biplane Navy and the modern monoplane one, it was obsolete by 1941. When carrying a 1,200-pound torpedo, the Devastator could barely stagger to 10,000 feet. Worse, its attack speed was a dangerously slow 110 knots. Armed with only a 50 caliber machine gun in the wing and a 30 caliber in the rear seat, it could neither run away from enemy fighters nor drive them off with its weak firepower. Its shortcomings were ominous, but its successor, the Grumman TBF Avenger, wasn't scheduled for delivery until early 1942. The Devastator, Wildcat, and Dauntless started the war as the Navy's primary carrier-based aircraft. Whatever their strengths and weaknesses, they would be forced to hold the line until newer planes reached the fleet. For the first 6 months of the Pacific War, this trio would carry the burden and manage to change the course of the war. Just before 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Japanese pilots attacking the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor encountered a scene similar to the images captured in these photographs taken just weeks earlier, with the bulk of the United States Navy's Pacific battleship fleet, as well as more than 100 other vessels laying at anchor or tied up alongside piers. When they departed 2 hours later, the scene was entirely different. Smoke from burning ships and planes filled the sky, and oil from sinking ships clogged the harbor. Nearly 2,400 men, women, and children were dead. The Japanese attack, carried out exclusively from aircraft carriers, caught the U.S. Pacific Fleet completely unprepared and was a milestone in the evolution of naval warfare. Yet in some respects, the fact that Japan succeeded in incapacitating America's battleship fleet hastened its ultimate defeat.
The big break that the United States Pacific Fleet had was that all three of its carriers were out of port that day. And the Nagumo strike planners had specifically targeted those carriers, hoping to destroy them in port. So that was a huge stroke of luck, which paid enormous dividends within the next 6 months.
American carriers, freed of their subordinate role, would now form the core of the surface fleet's offensive operations, a concept that the United States Navy had previously only experimented with. As the Pacific Fleet gathered its remaining resources, the Navy was poised to enter a new era, one in which aircraft carriers and their air groups replaced the battleship as the centerpiece of naval warfare.
Following Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet only had one way, effectively, to strike back. It did not become immediately obvious, but the torpedo scandal of 1942 essentially robbed the American submarine community of a viable weapon. And as that became more obvious, it necessarily lessened the options open to Admiral Nimitz, who replaced Admiral Kimmel as sink-packed fleet. The only option remaining, really, was a series of hit-and-run carrier raids, primarily throughout the Central and South Pacific.
Early in February 1942, Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and centered on the carrier Yorktown, attacked several Japanese garrisons in the Gilbert Islands, while Task Force 8, commanded by William F. Halsey and centered on the carrier Enterprise, struck the Marshalls. The following month, the Navy launched its first dramatically successful two-carrier strike when air groups from the Yorktown and Lexington crossed the towering Owen Stanley Range in New Guinea and destroyed Japanese invasion forces at Lae and Salamaua.
The Japanese commander at Rabaul was so shocked by this that he asked for additional amphibious ship assets to take Port Moresby and a carrier division to support that operation so that this sort of thing wouldn't happen again. And that request set the stage for the vital Battle of Coral Sea, which took place 2 months later.
None of these raids were terribly successful in and of themselves, but U.S. naval aviation did gain valuable operational experience while suffering few losses. It was clear that the composition of the pre-war air groups was valid and that training and techniques were effective, especially dive bombing. It also became apparent that the Japanese, while skilled and formidable opponents, were not invincible.
The confidence, probably as much as anything, that was gained from those early hit-and-run raids was something of a factor in giving our guys at the sharp end, those who were going head-to-head with the Japanese, some degree of confidence that they could do the job. All they needed was the opportunity, and those opportunities did come in May at the Coral Sea and certainly at Midway in June.
In mid-April, the United States, seeking to boost American morale by striking a blow directly against Japan, launched an unusual strike from the carrier Hornet. A flight of 16 U.S. Army Air Corps B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle took off into a 40-knot gale some 700 miles offshore, struggled aloft, and a few hours later scattered incendiaries and bombs over Tokyo, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. All but one of the attacking bombers escaped to safety in mainland China or the Soviet Union. Though the damage inflicted by the raid was negligible, it made a profound impression on the Japanese military leadership. Deeply embarrassed by having exposed the emperor to danger and fed up with the harassing American carriers, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, proposed an operation that would push the boundaries of the empire further into the Pacific and provide a forward base from which the U.S. forces in the Hawaiian Islands could be neutralized. The centerpiece of this plan was an invasion of Midway Island with an earlier feint towards Alaska to draw off American forces. When the U.S. Pacific Fleet responded to the landings on Midway, Japanese carriers and battleships waiting unseen to the west of the Midway landing force would fall upon and destroy the unsuspecting Americans. The Naval General Staff approved the Midway operation, subsequent to an attack on Port Moresby that would complete the occupation of New Guinea and threaten Australia's link with America. Early in May, 3 Japanese carriers, Shoho, Zuikaku, and Shokaku, were assigned to cover a fleet of assault transports destined for Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, and Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would put supply lines to northern Australia within range of Japanese land-based aircraft. But as was often the case, good communications intelligence put the U.S. Pacific Fleet in position to meet the Japanese. The men aboard the Lexington and Yorktown were about to face the first real test of American naval aviation. On May 4, 1942, in a prelude to what would become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea, aircraft from the USS Yorktown attacked a small Japanese amphibious force sent to capture Tulagi and the southern Solomon Islands. Air Group 5 launched attacks all day that caused significant damage. But it was here that the Americans discovered a major problem with the SBD.
The telescopic sights that the dive bomber pilots were using really were useless in combat. And part of the problem was the humidity in the tropics was causing their windscreens and the telescopic sights to fog over. So at the critical moment of attack where they're trying to come to their release point and get their bombs on the target, they could hardly see anything out of the aircraft because the windshields were so fogged up.
2 days later, after maneuvering westward to intercept the Japanese assault force bound for New Guinea, American scout planes stumbled upon the Japanese light carrier Shoho and her escorts.
In carrier warfare, job one was find the opposition, because that gave you enormous advantage. Not only could you position your forces for maximum benefit, but you could usually get in the first lick, and that did happen the first time at bat in Coral Sea, when, more by luck than design, we found the Japanese light carrier Shoho steaming under clear skies with maximum visibility.
There must have been 100 to 140 of them swarming our fleet all at once. Meanwhile, we only had 9 planes patrolling from our carrier. There were another 9 from another carrier, which made it 18. These 18 of us were going against the gang of 100 or something bombers and fighters. We had no clue how to do it, so we just randomly fired at whoever came in front.
The first attack ever mounted by U.S. naval aviators against an enemy capital ship was executed with textbook precision. Shoho never stood a chance. The years spent developing attack doctrine paid off in full, as American aircraft scored an estimated 13 bomb and 7 torpedo hits in just over 20 minutes.
Scout bomber squadrons went in first and dropped their 500-pound bombs on the Shoho, and that was designed to help suppress the anti-aircraft fire and destroy the deck so they couldn't launch additional fighters. And then came the mailed fist of both air groups, the dive bombers, carrying 1,000-pound bombs, and the bombing squadrons did devastating damage to the Shoho. And at the same time, the Devastator squadrons launched flawless anvil attacks that caught the Shoho from both bows and put 7 torpedoes into her. And as a result, the ship sank in 20 minutes, and never again would you see such a perfectly executed attack on the part of U.S. naval aviators. This was the quintessential attack of World War II.
The loss of Shoho prompted the Japanese command to postpone the New Guinea operation, and troop ships bound for Port Moresby were ordered to reverse course and return to Rabaul. On the American side, there was great excitement. After months of defeat and frustration, the Allies had their first naval success of the Pacific War. A pilot's radio report of the Shoho's sinking, Scratch 1 flat top, would become one of the most famous signals of World War II. But the Battle of the Coral Sea was far from over. The next day, both sides located each other and launched full air group strikes. This was the first time in the war that America's best naval aviators went up against their Japanese counterparts. However, the American strikes ran into heavy weather en route and their formations broke down.
Weather was frequently a factor in the early carrier battles. On May 8th, Yorktown and Lexington were steaming under blue skies, whereas Shokaku and Zuikaku had the benefit of rain squalls and used them to advantage. So much so that only about half the American aircraft that were launched on May 8th actually made contact with the Japanese ships.
Hidden by rain, Zuikaku escaped detection, but Shokaku did not. As American pilots rolled into the attack, the air around them filled with ack-ack and swarming Zeros. The SBDs took the brunt of the fusillade, and many went down in flames. The TBDs didn't do any better. Intercepted by Zeros during their wave-top runs, they failed to score a torpedo hit. Yet in spite of the strong opposition, the Americans did manage to score 3 bomb hits on Shokaku, knocking her out of the battle. At the very moment the dive bombers descended on Shokaku, Japanese planes struck with deadly force at the U.S. fleet. The F-4Fs waded into the onrushing aircraft, but there were too many bombers and not enough combat air patrol fighters. The bombers broke through. In a fast and violent action, the Japanese sent 2 torpedoes into Lexington's port side, scored a bomb hit on the flight deck, another in the island, and added several damaging near misses. Yorktown fared better, suffering a single bomb hit, but the blast and resulting fires killed and injured dozens of crewmen. Believing that they had mortally wounded both carriers, the Japanese withdrew, but in spite of the hits they'd taken, Yorktown and Lexington were both able to recover aircraft from their returning air groups. Lexington seemed to have survived, but at 12:47, a huge internal explosion started a large fire and badly damaged internal communications. More explosions followed, and the situation rapidly deteriorated. At 17:07 hours, the order was given to abandon ship.
Well, after the Lexington went down, USS Yorktown and the remaining American ships turned south and ran out of the Coral Sea. At the same time, the Japanese, with their damaged aircraft carrier, turned around and headed north towards Truk. So both sides actually withdrew.
This was the first time in history that aircraft carriers had actually fought each other. And if ever there had been any doubt, especially on the American side, that the war in the Pacific was going to hinge upon aircraft carriers, Coral Sea would have removed any doubt about that, because those were the only types of ships that were directly engaged. And for the first time in naval history, the opposing fleets never even sighted one another. So Coral Sea is where carrier combat really began.
The Battle of the Coral Sea provided the United States Navy with a host of lessons and exposed weaknesses in both its doctrine and its aircraft that would need to be corrected if the carrier force was to realize its full potential.
The Devastator just did not have the speed, the fuel carrying capacity, and the altitude requirements needed to stay with the other 2 main aircraft types in the air groups, the Wildcat and the Dauntlesses. So they, by necessity, had to fly lower than the rest of the air groups when they were striking a target. Well, this presented major doctrinal problems for the Wildcat pilots trying to escort and cover both the Devastators and the Dauntlesses. What were they going to do? Were they going to fly high with the Dauntlesses? Were they going to go down low, stay with the Devastators? Were they going to split their divisions up and cover both? Well, it was a major problem, and it was not going to be solved until the Devastator was removed from fleet service and replaced by something else.
Another problem was the Wildcat's inferiority to the Zero. Without any formal tactics to counter it, the A6M pilots were able to best the F4Fs in both engagements on May 8th. Part of the problem was that there just weren't enough Wildcats to accomplish all the tasks at hand. More serious, though, was the F4F's slow climb rate. It took far too long to get to the altitude of the incoming Japanese raids, a problem that would reoccur throughout 1942's 3 remaining carrier battles.
The SBDs had their share of problems too. The most significant was the windscreen fogging issue, and that had to be resolved if the Dauntless was going to be an effective platform in humid conditions. But also, one of the other things that came to light was the fact that without proper escort, without enough Wildcats to protect them, the Dauntless was really at the mercy of the Zero. If it wasn't for the fact that the Dauntless was pretty darn rugged for a single-engine aircraft, there would have been even more losses. But as it was, the dive bombers would and continued to suffer through much of 1942 heavy losses at the hands of Japanese Zero pilots.
While Coral Sea had revealed major operational problems with the TBD, the results of the battle, particularly the attack on the Shoho, led some to believe that the Devastator was more effective than the Dauntless.
Because of the windshield fogging problems, the Dauntlesses in their dives had a significant number of misses. Well, the Devastators seemed to be more accurate, and they didn't run into enemy fighters, so they didn't lose as many aircraft as the dive bombing and scout squadrons did, because the cap was up high and intercepted the SBDs. So some of the operational conditions surrounding the attack on the Shoho masked the weaknesses of the TBD, which would become abundantly evident later.
Though the Japanese could rightly claim a tactical victory, the Battle of the Coral Sea was an operational and strategic defeat for them, and the first major check on the great offensive they had begun 5 months earlier at Pearl Harbor. Not only were the Japanese forced to cancel the invasion of Port Moresby, they had lost the services of 2 fleet carriers. Although Zuikaku was only slightly damaged, her air group had been badly depleted. With only 40 aircraft left, she had to return to Japan to replenish. Shokaku took 6 months to repair. Neither carrier was able to take part in the Battle of Midway, contributing by their absence to that critical Japanese defeat. For nearly 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had decimated Allied opposition from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Now, a month after the embarrassing reverse at the Battle of the Coral Sea, a vast Japanese armada built around the carriers Hiryu, Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga endeavored to strike a death blow on the U.S. Pacific Fleet near the tiny American outpost at Midway.
If the United States Pacific Fleet and its Army counterparts were forced to withdraw from Hawaii with a Japanese buildup only 1,100 miles from Pearl Harbor, that would allow Japan the critical breathing space she needed to digest the enormous ocean and land areas along the Pacific Rim that they had accumulated in the previous 6 months.
There are 2 major islands in Midway, Sand Island and Eastern Island. Japan's plan was to not only attack them, but also to ultimately occupy them. We knew American carriers, which survived the Pearl Harbor attack, would show up if we attacked Midway, which would give us a chance to destroy the American operating units. That was our strategy.
Yet as the Imperial fleet steamed confidently toward Midway, the United States Navy was poised to surprise this deadly force.
Admiral Nimitz's problem was considerably simplified in that Commander Rochefort's codebreakers were able to tell him not only when and where the Japanese were going to strike next, specifically at Midway at dawn on June 4th, but there was going to be a diversionary raid in the Aleutians, which Nimitz therefore knew he could largely ignore, and it also gave the composition of the Japanese strike force. So the amount and detail of information available to the U.S. Pacific Fleet was simply phenomenal, and Japan, by contrast, was operating largely in the blind.
The mistake Commander Nagumo made was to presume there were no aircraft carriers out in the East Pacific. For instance, it was believed Yorktown must be damaged in the Coral Sea battle, and the other 2, Hornet and Enterprise, must be down in the South Pacific.
Knowing that the Japanese target would be Midway, the Americans reinforced the island and prepared to lay a trap with the 3 remaining fleet carriers in the Pacific, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which had been hastily patched up after being seriously damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Weeks of normal repair work were crammed into just 3 days.
Shortly before the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy tried to upgrade its fighter squadrons. The first thing they did was they bolstered the number from 18 to 27 planes in each squadron and gave them brand new F-4F-4 Wildcats. Now, the -4 was different from the one that was used at Coral Sea, which was the -3. For one, it had pilot armor, it had self-sealing fuel tanks, it was more survivable, it had a third more firepower, so it carried 6 50 calibers instead of 4. Well, there were some drawbacks to this. It was less maneuverable, it was more underpowered, it had a slower climb rate, and it had a shorter radius of action. And once they got into battle, they discovered that even 27 fighters was not enough for each fighter squadron to carry out all of their assignments in battle effectively.
On June 2nd, Task Force 17, under the command of Admiral Jack Fletcher and centered on USS Yorktown, rendezvoused with Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway. The spot of empty ocean was optimistically designated Point Luck and placed the Americans on the flank of the anticipated enemy thrust, expected on or soon after June 3rd. Greatly outnumbered, American hopes hinged on achieving surprise, and to that end, the Navy deployed about 30 PBY Catalina flying boats to Midway to conduct long-range searches. PBYs first detected Japanese invasion transports approaching from the southeast on the 3rd, but by 0530 on the 4th, the combined fleet's carrier force, the Kido Butai, had yet to be located.
Each airplane would fly out 700 miles, turn left and go 100 miles, and then turn left again and come back to base. So with 12 airplanes, you could cover 184 degrees. And Ensign Reed, the most counterclockwise pilot from the other squadron, discovered this Japanese fleet coming in from the west. Rochefort had predicted this. I didn't know it, but the officers up the line knew it.
The series of reports from the PBYs left no doubt that the Japanese carriers had been located and that a large enemy air contingent was bound for Midway. This was Nagumo's first strike, a force of 108 planes equally divided among escorting Zeros, Kate torpedo planes, and Val dive bombers. When the reports reached Midway, it prompted a mad dash to get airborne. It was critical that the island's aircraft not be caught on the ground as had happened at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines. As VMF 221's Wildcats and Buffaloes took off and climbed to intercept, the island's bombers took flight and headed for the Japanese fleet unescorted. At 0607, Admiral Fletcher issued his orders to Task Force 16. Spruance and his staff conferred, and on the advice of Captain Miles Browning, it was decided to throw everything Task Force 16 had at the Japanese at 0700 rather than wait and close the range.
The American defenders, even though they were cast as the underdogs, had a considerable option for how they were going to engage the Japanese. Very briefly, it was conventional carrier operations conducted from Enterprise, Hornet, in Yorktown, but you also had high-level bombing attacks with the Army B-17s, low-level torpedo attacks launched from Midway with the Avengers and the Marauders, and then the Marine Scout Bomber Squadron, which flew a mixture of SBDs and Vought SB-2Us.
We took off and started climbing on a heading of 320. We were told that the Japanese were out there 170 miles, and we never did make it to the carriers because we'd have never made it to the carriers because the further we went, the more Zeros there were.
Back at Midway, VMF 221's attempt to intercept Japanese strike aircraft met with disaster. 15 of the 26 Marine fighters were shot out of the sky, while others landed in the midst of the Japanese attack and were destroyed on the ground. Japanese planes, virtually free of opposition in the air, raged over both Eastern and Sand Island, blasting oil tanks, seaplane hangars, and other shore facilities. But intense anti-aircraft fire from the Marine defenders damaged or destroyed many of the attackers and limited the strike's effectiveness. Midway remained a viable airbase, and at 0700, the Japanese Strike Force commander, en route back to the carriers, signaled Nagumo that another strike would be necessary if assault troops were to go ashore by June 7. Six months earlier, Admiral Nagumo had decided against sending a third strike against Pearl Harbor, a fateful decision that spared many crucial facilities. But believing he was unopposed by American surface craft since his reconnaissance planes had found nothing but open ocean, Nagumo decided to perform a second attack on Midway. At 0715, just minutes after the Kido Butai had successfully evaded an uncoordinated torpedo attack by Midway-based TBFs and Marauders, Nagumo ordered aircraft that had been prepared and reserved for naval units to be rearmed to attack ground targets.
We received instructions to unload the torpedoes and load bombs. That was a lot of work. I would take the torpedo off and carry it, then bring the bomb and load it. We didn't have time to bring the bombs downstairs, so we left them on deck.
With the rearmament well underway, Nagumo received vague but alarming news from a reconnaissance flight 240 miles northeast of Midway.
Consequently, Admiral Nagumo and his air staff had to decide whether they wanted to proceed with the attack on Midway or if they would prefer to incur the unavoidable delay in downloading bombs and uploading torpedoes for an attack on the American forces now instead of a follow-up attack on Midway.
At 07:45, the order was given to change from bombs back to torpedoes, followed by a demand for clarification of the enemy's disposition. Meanwhile, 16 Midway-based SBDs arrived over the Kido Butai at 07:55. Ordered to glide bomb rather than power dive, none scored a hit and half were shot down. But the attack left the Japanese defensive formations in disarray. Clarification of the scouts' earlier report arrived as preparations were being made to receive aircraft returning from the strike on Midway. But at 08:14, 15 B-17s arrived to unload their payload on the already disorganized fleet. Dropped from 20,000 feet, the bombs fell harmlessly in the water. But the attack delayed recovery operations and prevented the Japanese from resuming a more defensible formation. At 08:20, the scout revised its earlier report, which presented Nagumo with a dilemma. But while he considered whether to strike immediately with available aircraft or to continue recovery and rearming operations, 11 Marine Corps Vindicators attacked his covering force. 10 vital minutes ticked away while for the 5th time that morning, Midway's aviators disrupted the Kido Butai's flight operations. With this latest threat turned away, Nagumo chose to complete the recovery of the Midway strike force, then to send a full-strength attack against the American warships. At 09:17, all 4 Japanese carriers swung to the northeast in order to close the range prior to launch, unaware that the first wave of aircraft from Task Force 16 was only 3 minutes away. For the Americans, many factors combined to make the imminent attack on the Japanese a caricature of what a combined airstrike should be. Squadrons of fighters and dive bombers from both Enterprise and Hornet were directed to form up after takeoff and circle overhead until the torpedo planes were aloft, then to depart as a group to maintain contact en route and then to synchronize their attack once the enemy was located, but it never happened. Sheer inexperience dragged out the launch, and by the time the last TBDs were away, the SBDs were long gone. The attack fragmented further when squadrons were unable to agree on the proper course to follow, which meant that as the 15 Devastators of Hornet's Torpedo 8 approached the enemy fleet from the northeast at 09:20, they came in completely devoid of fighter cover.
On Kaga, as it used to be a warship, there were about 6 secondary guns around. They went off with a loud noise, and we heard the battle horn. So I went out from the pilot's room to where the machine guns were. There, I saw all those torpedo attack planes. The Japanese carriers were pretty good at dodging the torpedoes, while the Zeros, 9 from each carrier, which made 36 of them, attacked the torpedo planes from both the American carriers in Midway and shot them down, one after another.
Between 09:20 and 10:24, torpedo attacks by squadrons from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown failed to score a single hit and suffered staggering losses as the Zeros enjoyed a field day. But the disorganized nature and tenacity of the attacks produced an unintended effect.
Because these attacks kept coming, one after another, piecemeal, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol never got any respite, and they had to keep rotating aircraft off the decks of the Japanese carriers while landing the ones that needed fuel and ammunition. So they were unable to get the strike against the American fleet carriers up on deck and launched before the American dive bombers showed up at 10:20 that morning.
Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, set out in pursuit of the Japanese at 0745. But when his two dive bomber squadrons reached the expected contact point at 0915, they found nothing but empty water.
McCluskey used impeccable logic in solving the problem. He allowed the Japanese a maximum rate of advance along their previous known track, which was to the northwest of Midway, and he made a right turn and followed that leg for about 15 minutes, found nothing, made another turn, and hit gold. He found a Japanese destroyer hastening to rejoin Kido Butai after having conducted an unsuccessful depth charge attack on an American submarine. And McCluskey simply applied logic. He assumed that that Japanese ship was returning to its force. He took that same heading based off the course of the Japanese destroyer, and shortly thereafter was looking at the wakes of 4 Japanese carriers.
As luck would have it, 2 squadrons of SBDs from Yorktown, acting on more recent intelligence, arrived on the scene at precisely the same moment. Unopposed by Zeros, which had gone down to attack the Devastators, 4 full squadrons rolled in on the Japanese carriers.
I went out to the deck and looked up and saw something reflecting in the sun. I knew they were dive bombers. I knew it was dangerous, since there were no fighter planes above us. We got hit by a bomb near the bridge. So then, as we had our hangar deck full of fueled aircraft, it caused a major fire. Somebody came yelling and told us that Akagi was hit. So we went running up on deck to see. We saw Akagi and Kaga on fire, but still moving. Also, Soryu was hit. In a moment, 3 of our carriers were lost, while they had Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. So it was 3 of them against Hiryu.
With this one attack, a handful of dauntless crews changed the entire Pacific War.
It has been part of the historiography of the Battle of Midway for years that those decks were full of strike aircraft about to take off to hit the Americans, and that the attacks devastated the flight decks, caused the fires, and that's what destroyed the ships. There's a kernel of truth in that. What happened was the carriers had all of their strike groups in the hangar decks in a contained environment, and the bombs that were dropped by the dive bombers, the American dive bombers, went through the flight deck and caused holocausts amongst the aircraft in these confined environments in the hangar decks. And that is why only a few bomb hits destroyed some of the most important capital ships in the world at that time.
Although Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were doomed, the Japanese were far from finished. At 10:45, just after the devastating U.S. dive bomber attack, Hiryu launched a retaliatory strike of 18 dive bombers, escorted by 6 fighters. Around 11:50, Yorktown's radar made an unexpected contact with a group of planes 32 miles west-southwest, and 6 minutes later, the 12 Wildcats of Yorktown's Combat Air Patrol, reinforced by 8 more F-4Fs from Enterprise and Hornet, intercepted. 11 of the 18 valves were shot down, but the rest fought their way through and fell upon Yorktown, the most exposed of the 3 American aircraft carriers.
They turned into the wind first. They went the other way, and the Hornet and us, we were going the other way. We turned off for the horizon, turned and launched our planes when they got hit, you know.
3 Japanese bombs found the mark. The first, which hit just after the midships elevator, opened a gaping hole and showered nearby gun positions with fragments. The second pierced the flight deck near the island and detonated deep within the ship, which caused serious damage to Yorktown's boilers. The final bomb penetrated the forward elevator and descended through several decks before it exploded, which caused a persistent but containable fire. The ship slowed to 6 knots while her crew worked to repair damage, but about 20 minutes after the second bomb hit, Yorktown slowed to a stop, dead in the water. Meanwhile, Hiryu launched a second strike at 13:30, consisting of 10 torpedo planes and 6 Zeros. Thanks to reconnaissance reports, the Japanese now knew they faced 3 American carriers and believed one of those to be heavily damaged.
The Japanese air crews in their briefing had been instructed to attack an undamaged carrier, if possible, in order to maximize the effects of the strike. What they had not anticipated was that Yorktown's superb damage control crew had not only effected repairs, but had got the ship underway again, working up to almost 20 knots.
Yorktown was refueling fighters on deck when at 14:27, the ship's radar picked up an incoming air group. CAP Wildcats were vectored to intercept, while the 10 fighters on board were hurriedly launched, some with as little as 23 gallons of fuel. 3 Zeros and as many as 5 Kates fell, but several torpedo planes managed to slip through.
When the second attack units reached Yorktown, there was no smoke or fire, and she was going at normal speed. So the commander of the second attack unit thought that this was a completely different ship, maybe Hornet or Enterprise, and they launched torpedoes.
Struck by 2 torpedoes in quick succession at about 14:45, Yorktown lost all power and rapidly took on a severe list, which increased to 26 degrees within minutes. Concerned that she was about to roll over, her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship at 14:55.
Now, in the meantime, Yorktown scout bombers had come back from the first mission, and they landed aboard Enterprise and were immediately absorbed into the Enterprise operations plan because another of the Yorktown aviators, Lieutenant Sam Adams, had found Hiryu.
With good intelligence as to the whereabouts of Hiryu, dive bombers from 1st Enterprise and then Hornet launched on that location. However, concern for task force defense meant that they went out minus fighter escort. At 16:45, the SBD spotted Hiryu, accompanied by her screen. Climbing to 19,000 feet, they attacked from directly out of the sun at 17:05.
Later, I learned that these were dive bombers from the Enterprise. There were 9 dive bombers, and they dropped 9 bombs. Only 4 hit, 5 missed, but the 4 were enough.
Shortly after recovering the last of the aircraft that had wrecked Hiryu, Admiral Spruance turned Task Force 16 east, away from the Japanese fleet. For the sailors and airmen who had survived, the long, challenging day came to an end. For the price of 1 fleet carrier and 1 destroyer lost, the U.S. Navy had torn the heart out of the Kido Butai.
Precise navigation and accurate reconnaissance and scouting played a significant role in the battle, and even though Yorktown eventually sank, the course of the Pacific War was irrevocably affected, and from that point on, Japan never again really took the strategic initiative. Thereafter, Japan was on the defensive.
I saw the carrier in silhouette, though the middle part was caved in. It didn't look anything like the Kaga I saw when I took off that morning. That's when I got it. This was defeat. I felt quite vain as I watched Kaga go down. That's how that day ended. That was the longest day in my life.